Okay, so let's continue with this. Now, Darwin and science, evolutionary science, thinks that this evidence is very compelling to say that no, because of the large difference between us and say the DNA sequence of our hemoglobin, for example, of a frog so different, and then ours in relation to that of an ocean creature is so different that we didn't necessarily evolve from a closer related ancestor as them. However, our relationship with land going mammals, okay, like a mouse or a monkey or a gorilla, especially the gorilla, um, shows how closely related our amino acid sequences are. And so evolutionary science says that yes, we must have evolved from a common ancestor, not necessarily just because of this, but because of this evidence along with our fossil evidence. Um, there's a lot of evidence they use, not only bone structure, but phenotypical or anatomical structure. Okay, as far as the hands and the bones in the arms and the leg and the pelvis, um, is so closely related as far as the way they look and what they're used for. Um, that is one part of evolution that science tries to make a link, because science is all about finding the reasons for the way things are. Okay, so they're trying to find a link between our species and other species on the planet. So this is where the controversy comes from. Okay, as far as they used to be thought that people used to think, and some even science used to say that, well, monkeys came first and then we evolved from a monkey, or a gorilla came first and then we evolved from a gorilla, or first there was bacteria and then somehow from a bacteria a fish was made or evolved, and then from a fish a frog evolved so it was able to go on land, and then from a frog a reptile evolved, and then from a reptile you had birds, and then from birds, and so there was this progression that science once thought this, and part of science still does, or science thinks about that part of that is still true, because there's nothing else scientifically speaking that's going to give scientific evidence that this is different. Okay, so that's where the controversy lies, and one of the things they use as this evidence to say, okay, you see how closely related are to some of these other organisms as far as our anatomical structure and our amino acid sequencing. That must mean now they've changed the view that that there wasn't a monkey first and then we evolved from a monkey. That's not what science looks at now, but there is the view that there must have been a common ancestor that branched off through evolutionary time, and monkeys and gorillas formed down one branch, and Homo sapien humans formed down the other branch. Okay, and that's what most science thinks of now when they think of evolution and our relation to other species. Um, they use these things called cladograms as well, kind of similar to an evolutionary tree, if you will, but it's going to map out um, amino acid sequences or differences in amino acid sequence and where branches came from. Okay, so the farther down towards the end here, you have the largest difference. Then as you move up this cladogram, up this line, and these branches that come off of it, you notice that there's smaller and smaller and smaller differences between um, us and other organisms. So the farthest down the line here, okay, who belongs on each branch? Well, who branched off before 100 differences in amino acid sequence? That would be the lamprey. Okay, so if we had a common ancestor for all organisms, then the first one to branch off from that common ancestry as far as adapting to its environment would be the lamprey here. And then between 100 amino acid differences in the sequence and 50, you would come across the frog. And then between 50 and 40, you would come across the chicken that branched off, okay, adapted to its environment, okay, adapted feathers or adapted the ability to lay hard eggs or with amniotic fluid and those types of things. And then from 30 to 20 would be the mouse that branched off, and then from 20 to no difference would have been the monkey and then the gorilla. Alright, so that just ties in with your amino acid sequence. There are also other evidence. Comparative anatomy. I mentioned anatomical structures. Okay, for example, there's one big difference between the amino acid sequence of our hemoglobin and that of a gorilla. Well, we can also use comparative anatomy or anatomical structures to look at similarities or differences as well. Homologous structures is a big one. Okay, homologous structures are just structures that share a common ancestry or structures that are similar but they have a different function. Okay, so they look similar or maybe they're built similar to other organisms but they have a different function. So think about our arm, okay, the human arm. The top part of our arm, okay, the bone from our shoulder to our elbow is called the humerus. Then there are two bones in our forearm between our elbow and our hand that is called the radius and the ulna. And then in our hand we have things called carpal bones that are called carpals, and then metacarpals, and eventually the bones in our fingers are called phalanges. Okay, so that's our overall bone structure of our arm. Well, if you compare that to a turtle also has a humerus. It also has in its forearm a radius and ulna, and then in its foot it has carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Same thing with an alligator. It also has a humerus in its arm, then in its forearm radius and ulna, and then here are the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Look at the wing of a bird. The wing of a bird has a humerus. It has a little different. Its radius and ulna have been extended into other parts, but here's its radius and ulna. Notice that the hand bones are a little elongated. They're not as distinct as the hand bones of an alligator or our hands. And then notice say this was the leg of a deer. Here's its humerus. It doesn't have two bones in its forearm. It just has one. And then here's its extended hand bones. Okay, so you notice that these are homologous structures because these are all arms or maybe front arms or front legs of an organism, or in the case of a bird, the wing. So they have similar structure, okay, as far as the bone structure of each one, but they're used for different things. They have different functions. Obviously, a turtle doesn't have fingers like an alligator has or like we has. The bird doesn't even have an arm like we would have or like an alligator has. And then a deer, or say a horse or something like that, with its leg as an arm, they're used in different ways. So this is what homologous structures are. Okay, and then here's my example I used for the human, okay, parts versus that of this would be like an alligator. This is actually the fin of a whale or the flipper of a whale. So you can see different animals. This could be a cat, okay, the leg of a cat versus the leg of a deer versus the arm of a bat, okay. And you can see the differences in how they're used, but they're very similar in their overall structure. Okay, another type of comparative anatomy would be vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures within an organism that had a purpose at one particular time during that organism's ancestry, but now it serves no purpose. Okay, it's still there, but it's maybe diminished in size, or it's it's definitely diminished in functionality because so it doesn't serve its original purpose because it's no longer used. Um, for examples, we have a tailbone. Okay, if you've ever fallen on your tailbone, and some people have, and you've been to the doctor and they say, oh, you broke your tailbone or you bruised your tailbone. Okay, we have a tailbone. If you look at our anatomy, we have little bones at the bottom of our spine. Okay, in the coccyx region of our spine, that is our tailbone. However, it doesn't serve the purpose of a tail. And we'll look at more examples of that in a minute. A snake has a pelvis. Okay, has a pelvic bone inside the anatomy of a snake, but a pelvis is going to allow for the formation of legs and then allow that creature to be able to walk on legs. Well, snakes don't have legs, but they have a pelvis. That's a vestigial structure. Our tailbone, a vestigial structure. There are tons of species out there that don't use their structure, these structures as what they originally intended. Think about an ostrich, has feathers. Or remember in the Darwin video we watched, the rayas in South America, they have feathers as well. They don't fly. Okay? Penguins have wings just like an ostrich or a raya does, but they don't fly either. There are other birds that you can say. There are certain types of flightless cormorants that look similar to ducks. Those ducks in the video, the Darwin video, that use their wings as paddles, but they can't fly. Okay, the penguins use their wings to swim as fins, but once again they don't fly. So those are examples of vestigial structures. They're not used for their original purpose. That organism, say for example the penguin, even though maybe at one time back when penguins first were on the planet, maybe they could fly. We're not for sure. We didn't live back then. We didn't keep records back then. But they lived in an environment where they didn't need to fly all the time. They lived in an environment, a cold environment, or in the case of the South American penguins, they probably migrated there. But original penguins lived in cold environments. Their food source was in the water, not in the sky. Okay? So they didn't need to fly. They needed to swim. And so they adapted to that. That doesn't mean that they didn't. They were a bird that could fly, and somehow they mutated wings that had the ability to act as insulation to where they could swim and not destroy the wings, or they. Anyways, there's no mutation that caused this to happen. They had the ability. The genes that allowed them to survive in that area are what genes were passed on. Okay, same thing with an ostrich. It got so big, it didn't need to fly. Okay, it found the ability to run was a lot easier, used less energy, so eventually it lost that ability. So those are vestigial structures. Okay, embryological similarities and differences. This is also a type of comparative anatomy. We can look at the embryos of animals and compare them and see that there are a lot of similarities when embryos are first forming between different species of organisms. For example, if you look at this picture, okay, here's a tail on this embryo, here's a tail on this one, here's a tail on this one, here's a tail on this one. They all have eyes and they all have a head, okay? But we don't know, just by looking at it, what type of organism that's going to grow into versus that, and so forth. But if you were to look, this embryo grows into this type of water salamander. This embryo is actually going to be a type of water salamander that has external gills. This embryo is actually a turtle. This embryo is actually a mammal. Okay? So you can definitely tell by looking at them. It's hard to tell the difference because they have similar structures like a tail and a head. Okay, but then once they start to develop through differentiation, then we start seeing those differences. If you look at this picture,